Hi there, welcome to Precon Recon, where we take a look at the data behind pre-constructed commander decks to see what cards players are cutting from their precons, what cards are they keeping, and what cards are they adding to spice up their lists and make them even more powerful. We're taking a look right now at the Witherbloom Witchcraft pre-constructed deck, which is led by Willowdusk, but also includes everyone's favorite chef, Guillaume. Lots of tasty food from him, definitely. This is a really interesting strategy to see green and black moving into with all of these extra payoffs for life gain to see if we can make our gain other people's pain. It's really cool, so what are players doing with the precon? Let's find out. Right off the bat, I think it's actually really important that we acknowledge that Guillaume is actually twice as popular as Willowdusk as a commander, even though Guillaume is the secondary commander and not the face of the pre-constructed deck like Willowdusk is. But even beyond that, neither of those commanders are as popular as two green-black commanders from the actual main Strixhaven set. Both Bellatrix Witherbloom and Dina Soulsteeper are more popular as commanders than either of the precon commanders, which is pretty interesting. There's a lot of brewing going on when it comes to green and black, which brewing seems pretty on point for Witherbloom, so A+ grade on that one. But let's focus in on the precon. What are players doing to that one to spice it up? Right off the bat, let's take a look at some core cards from the precon that players seem to be holding onto from the deck, regardless of which commander they end up choosing. Blossoming Bogbeast is the first one we've got to shout out here, because holy crap is this card cool. At a minimum, it's going to provide a +2/+2 and trample to all of our creatures, and that is surprisingly good, especially if we're able to manipulate it even further beyond that point, which isn't very difficult for either of these Golgari commanders to do. This is a great life gain payoff, but honestly, since this is kind of a mini Pathbreaker Ibex all in its own right, I frankly wouldn't even be surprised if Blossoming Bogbeast ends up showing up in other non-life gain themed decks down the road. Beyond that, it's pretty important to note that a lot of the precon holdovers that we're seeing from the main deck tend to be artifacts that help us gain life. Stuff like Venser's Journal, Alhammarret's Archive can help enhance our life gain, Noxious Gearhulk is another. These are really interesting to see as a pattern. Green and black are somewhat decent at gaining life, but they're not nearly as great as white tends to be. So the ability to gain a whole bunch of life is slightly more hamstrung in these colors, which means that we have to rely a little bit more on stuff like artifacts to supplant that need. There are a couple of great standouts like Verdant Sun's Avatar that can be really big boosts of life gain, but those are surprisingly few and far between. So this deck definitely seems to be relying upon artifacts to help fill in those gaps. But easily one of the most important types of cards that we're seeing players hold onto from the original precon when they're tuning up their decks are the life gain payoffs. Stuff like Dina Soulsteeper, but also Sanguine Bond, or even the new Trudge Garden seem to be sticking around in a lot of players' decks as they're tuning up, because they're great ways to weaponize all of the life gain. We don't just want our life total to go up, we want other players' life totals to go down. So now let's talk about the cards that players are most often removing from the precon. When tuning up and optimizing, these cards just don't make the cut. I mentioned earlier that artifacts are pretty helpful in these colors to find extra ways to gain big swings of life, but as it turns out, there are plenty of artifacts from the original precon that aren't pulling their weight like they should be. Things like Paradise Plume, Sun Droplet, Druidic Satchel, and Elixir of Immortality are being cut from 44 to 60% of the precons. They're just too small, and in a lot of cases kind of inconsistent when it comes to how much life they'll give us or when they'll give us that life. Willowdusk in particular would really prefer to have bigger life swings than these artifacts can provide, so they're just not really sticking around. According to the data, we also see that 55% of players are cutting Taste of Death and Gluttonous Troll from the precons, but already we have to pause right there and acknowledge that that is a change that is happening on behalf of Willowdusk, but not one that is happening on behalf of Guillaume. Those are food token creation cards that Guillaume is, if you'll forgive the pun, eating up. Guillaume's page is actually full of tons of food token creation cards and is totally keeping those around. But his deck does register a little bit differently from the precon, because it's more built from the ground up and is a substantially different strategy, whereas Willowdusk has a lot more in common with the original precon deck. The data is registering it a little bit differently, so keep in mind that those are cuts that are definitely being made for one commander, but not for the other. Moving on though, there are still plenty of other cards from the original precon that players are removing from their decks at a really high rate, because they don't suit either of our commanders. For example, Eudora Gravegardener and Ob Nixilis are both being cut from over 50% of these decks, because they just don't seem to really be at home here. Maybe they're in the wrong college, at least Ob Nixilis seems to be. And Eudora in particular seems like it's going to be way more at home in like a Morph deck, for instance. Then there are a couple of cards that are just lackluster in terms of their life gain. For example, 53% of players are cutting the card Gift of Paradise from their precons, and 47% are cutting the card Nissa's Renewal. They're just a little bit clunky, especially as ramp and as life gain go. In fact, if we want ramp, we've got better options, but if we want life gain, we've got way better options. We could just give our big creatures lifelink, and then we'd gain a whole bunch more life that way. That seems a lot more reliable than trying to use these awkward spells to get a big boost. Lastly, the most interesting category of cards that we're seeing players are commonly cutting from their precons are actually life gain trigger payoff cards. 40 to 50% of players are cutting cards like Epicure of Blood, Ageless Entity, and Bloodthirsty Aerialist from their precons, which I think is really fascinating. I mean, these are life gain trigger payoff cards. You'd think that our life gain deck would love to have them around, right? Well, as it turns out, they actually do kind of contradict some of the missions of our commander like Willow Dusk. Willow Dusk doesn't want us to have individual instances of life gain. We want to have just a whole bunch of life gain in one turn, just boom, 10, all in one go. Whereas something like the Epicure of Blood or the Bloodthirsty Aerialist would prefer to have individual instances, like one life here, one life there, maybe even spread out across multiple turns. Which, even though those are both life gain payoffs, our commander doesn't like that at all. So they do kind of contradict the mission of what this deck is probably really all about once we start tuning up. That, and also some of these cards have kind of clunky mana costs, let's be real. It takes a lot of time for them to build up, and when they come down a little bit later on, and it takes more time for them to build up, it also doesn't necessarily need to make the cut there. But mostly just take that lesson there that even though there are life gain payoff cards in this life gain deck, sometimes they don't actually have all that much synergy with what the commander is really trying to do. Now, those were cards that players were cutting from the precon, but what cards are they most commonly adding to it to make it even more impactful? Well, as it turns out, the answer largely depends upon which commander you end up choosing. In the other precons, we saw that there was a decent amount of overlap between the face commander or the secondary commander. Though they will ultimately take you down different paths, there are still some cards that can apply to either one of those commanders. That is a lot less the case here. Whether you're choosing Willow Dusk or you're choosing Guillaume, you're going to get pretty substantially different decks by the end of those deck building journeys. Let's start with Guillaume, for example. Guillaume's page is filling up to the brim with food token creation cards. He's got the originals from the precon and more. Stuff like Feasting Troll King, Gilded Goose, and Witch's Oven are totally populating his page, and they are just making it very difficult for opponents to remove any of his creatures because he can just turn them indestructible. It's really, really cool stuff, but that doesn't even scratch the surface. In my opinion, the coolest stuff happening on his page are the ways that we can turn food munching into opponent punching. Stuff like Marionette Master or Disciple of the Vault take advantage of the fact that the food are artifact tokens, which I just think is really awesome. There's even stuff like Inspiring Statuary on his page to turn the food into mana. This is a very fascinating take, but it's substantially different from what we see with Willow Dusk. Meanwhile, what's Willow Dusk up to? Well, it seems like the answer is going big. I mean, there are some smaller role fillers that we should definitely acknowledge right off the bat, like Kodama's Reach, Sakura Tribe Elder, Putrefy, all filling in some of the gaps there. And actually, even 17% of players are adding Essence Warden to the precon as well, because, even though it is individual instances of life gain, it's still a decent chunk of life over the course of a couple turns for sure. But really, the most exciting stuff that we're seeing here are stuff like Grey Merchant of Asphodel and Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose. Those are really, really big life swings, but it doesn't stop there. My favorite piece about what Willow Dusk is up to are the ways that we're not just taking advantage of life gain, but also our own life drain. So stuff like Bolus's Citadel and Villas are also being added to a bunch of those precons, because they're just a great way to have a bunch of life payment, which Willow Dusk can also take advantage of, and will get tons of card advantage along the way. Sadly, an unfortunate reality we have to contend with when it comes to upgrades for this precon is that it appears as though a lot of the cards that players want to add to the deck are priced out of availability. For example, cards like Toxic Deluge or Exsanguinate are hugely cool cards, especially for a life gain strategy where we can manipulate life totals so significantly. But because they're great cards and because life gain is a really popular strategy in Commander, they've had the opportunity to accumulate in price over the years. Even stuff like Whip of Erebos is kind of expensive, and that's a great card, especially for Willow Dusk. When our creatures have lifelink and then we deal some damage, we'll be able to put a bunch of +1 counters onto them, which means that next time we deal damage, we'll gain even more life and then can put even more +1 counters onto them. Like, that's an amazing feedback loop. And of course, there's Exquisite Blood, one of the best life gain and drain payoffs out there, but it's also like $50. The percentage inclusion rates for precon upgrades for these cards would be way higher if they were easier to acquire, but unfortunately, a lot of the life gain cards out there are kind of expensive, and that makes it tough for some of these precon upgrades. I highly recommend looking into any budget replacements you can for them, especially the Whip of Erebos. Like, that is a really great strategy for Willow Dusk. Highly recommend finding as many other alternatives as you can, because they open a lot of really cool deck building paths. The last thing I want to note is the swaps that players are most commonly making to this Precon deck's original mana base, and as it turns out, I actually don't have a whole lot to report here. Stuff like Study Hall and Temple of the False God aren't really making the cut, those are getting cut from a whole bunch of Precons, but most of the utility lands are actually sticking around. Stuff like Radiant Fountain or Sapseep Forest, just small incidental tiny bits of life gain here and there that are for free right there in the mana base and could potentially add up. They're sticking around on the Precon, and I think that's pretty neat to see. In fact, most of the swaps that we're seeing are just the inclusion of some pretty general color-fixing lands like Overgrown Tomb or the new Necroblossom Snarl, for instance. Basically, a lot of the typical fare that we would expect to see. Oh, and of course there's Bojuka Bog. Because, Bojuka Bog. So those were the most popular swaps that we're seeing players make to the Witherbloom Witchcraft Precon deck, but what do you think? Are there cards that players are cutting that you don't think they should be, or cards that you definitely think that they should add to their decks? And do you think that Willowdusk is potentially being a little bit underrated as a commander, or is Guillaume definitely the master chef? We'd love to know your thoughts, so leave them below, and we'll see you on the next Precon Recon.